A teen was being branded as property until a rancher pulled the iron from the fire. The iron glowed white-hot in the dying embers of the campfire, its crude symbol promising pain and permanent ownership. 16-year-old Maria Santos pressed her back against the rough bark of the cottonwood tree, her wrists raw from the ropes that bound her there. The three men who had taken her from the wagon train 2 days ago stood around the fire, their faces twisted with cruel anticipation. "This one's gonna fetch a good price down in El Paso," growled Jake Morrison, the leader of the trafficking ring. His weathered face bore the scars of a lifetime of violence. "But first, we make sure she can't run. Brand marks him as ours, makes the buyers know they're getting damaged goods they can control." Maria's heart hammered against her ribs as Morrison lifted the branding iron from the coals. The symbol, a jagged M for Morrison, pulsed with heat that she could feel from 6 feet away. She had witnessed this horror before, seen the permanent scars left on other victims who had been dragged through this nightmare trade route that stretched from Texas to Mexico. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "I have family. They'll pay whatever you want." Morrison laughed, a sound like grinding gravel. "Too late for that, girl. Your property now. This here's just making it official." The other 2 men, brothers named Cal and Dutch Brennan, moved closer to hold her still. Cal's yellowed teeth showed in a vicious grin as he reached for her arm. That's when the first shot rang out. The bullet struck the branding iron, sending it spinning from Morrison's grasp in a shower of sparks. The white-hot metal landed in the dirt with a hiss, immediately beginning to cool. Morrison spun toward the darkness beyond the firelight, his hand moving to his pistol. "I wouldn't," came a voice from the shadows. It was calm, measured, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Next shot won't be aimed at the iron." A figure stepped into the flickering light of the campfire. He was tall and lean, maybe 40 years old, with steel-gray hair beneath a well-worn hat. His clothes marked him as a working rancher, practical boots, denim worn soft from years of honest labor, and a leather vest that had seen countless days under the sun. But it was his eyes that made Morrison hesitate. They were the color of winter sky, cold and absolutely unwavering. "Name's Samuel Cross," the stranger said, his rifle trained steadily on Morrison's chest. "I run cattle about 20 miles north of here. Been tracking you boys for the better part of a week." "This ain't your business, Cross," Morrison snarled, though he didn't draw his weapon. "Girls are property now. We got papers." Cross's expression didn't change. "Funny thing about papers, they're only as good as the law that backs them. And the law says human beings can't be property, hasn't for quite some time now." Dutch Brennan, the younger and more impulsive of the brothers, made the mistake of going for his gun. Cross's rifle barked twice in rapid succession. The first bullet shattered Dutch's wrist, sending his pistol flying. The second took Cal in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Morrison raised his hand slowly, finally understanding that he was facing someone far more dangerous than he had anticipated. "You boys have been running a route through my territory," Cross continued conversationally, as if he hadn't just disabled 2 armed men, "taking people off wagon trains, selling them down south. Local sheriff's been looking the other way because Morrison here's been paying him off. But Sheriff Watson had an unfortunate encounter with a rattlesnake last week. New sheriff's a friend of mine." Maria stared at her unexpected rescuer in amazement. Samuel Cross moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down rustlers, outlaws, and worse in his years on the frontier. But there was something more than just competence in his actions. There was a moral certainty that reminded her of her father. "Cut her loose," Cross ordered Morrison. "Now see here," Morrison began. The rifle swung toward him. "I said cut her loose. These hands of mine aren't as steady as they used to be. Might accidentally pull this trigger." Morrison's knife made quick work of the ropes. Maria rubbed her wrists, trying to restore circulation to her hands. Her legs were unsteady, but anger gave her strength. "There are others," she said urgently. "They have a camp about a day's ride south. Women and children they've taken." Cross nodded grimly. "I figured as much. This operation's been too organized to be just these three. He glanced at the wounded Brennan brothers, both of whom were conscious but in no condition to fight. Question is, how many more like you are down there, Morrison? Morrison spat into the dirt. Go to hell. Already been, Cross replied mildly. Didn't much care for it. He turned to Maria. You know how to handle a rifle, miss? Yes, sir. My father taught me. Cross tossed her Dutch's abandoned pistol. Good. Keep an eye on these three while I gather up their weapons. We've got a long night ahead of us. As Cross collected the scattered firearms, Maria learned more about her rescuer. Samuel Cross had lost his wife and young son to cholera 3 years earlier. Since then, he had thrown himself into his ranch work and had become something of a guardian angel for travelers passing through the territory. He had an unofficial arrangement with the new sheriff to investigate crimes the law couldn't or wouldn't address. You didn't have to do this, Maria said as Cross bound the wounds of the Brennan brothers with strips torn from their own shirts. You could have just rode on. Cross looked up at her, and for a moment, his steely composure cracked slightly. My boy would have been about your age now. I like to think someone would have stepped in if he'd needed help. By dawn, they had Morrison and the brothers secured and were riding south. Cross had found the traffickers' horses and appropriated their supply. Morrison, his hands bound behind his back and tied to his saddle horn, had finally broken down and provided details about the main camp. There's maybe 8 or 10 men down there, he admitted as they rode through the mesquite and sage, plus whoever they picked up in the last week. They move the cargo every 2 weeks, take them down to El Paso, then on into Mexico. Cargo, Cross repeated flatly. That what you call human beings? Morrison had the grace to look ashamed, though Maria doubted his remorse ran very deep. The main camp was hidden in a box canyon about 15 miles from the Mexican border. Cross left the prisoners tied to trees a mile away and scouted ahead with Maria. From a ridge overlooking the canyon, they could see the extent of the operation. Dear God, Maria whispered. There were at least 20 captives in the camp, women, children, and a few men. They were kept in a makeshift pen constructed of rope and wooden stakes. Guards patrolled the perimeter, and Maria counted 8 men total. The victims looked gaunt and desperate, some bearing the brands that Morrison had intended for her. We need help, Maria said. There are too many of them. Cross was quiet for a long moment, studying the camp through his spyglass. Help's coming, he said finally. Should be here within the hour. As if summoned by his words, Maria heard the sound of hoofbeats from behind them. She turned to see a group of riders approaching, 6 men wearing badges, led by a tall man with a thick mustache. Sheriff Coleman, Cross called softly as the lawman dismounted. Sam, the sheriff's voice was grim. Got your message. Brought some good men with me. He looked down into the canyon. Hell of a thing. Hell of a thing. Cross agreed. You want to take them alive? Coleman spat into the dust. Preferably. But if they resist arrest. He shrugged. The attack came at noon, when the guards were changing shifts, and the men in the camp were gathered around the cook fire for their midday meal. Cross and 3 of the deputies circled around to block the canyon's only exit, while Coleman and the others rode straight down the main trail. Federal marshals, Coleman shouted as his horse thundered into the camp. You're all under arrest. The traffickers' response was predictably violent. Guns blazed in the canyon as the criminals tried to fight their way out, but Cross and his men were positioned perfectly, and the outlaws found themselves caught in a crossfire with no escape route. The battle was brief but decisive. 3 of the traffickers were killed in the initial exchange of gunfire. 2 more fell as they tried to reach their horse. The remaining 3, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Maria rode down into the canyon with the posse, her heart breaking at the condition of the captives. Many had been held for weeks, subsisting on minimal food and water. Several bore the horrific brand marks that Morrison's gang used to mark their property, but they were alive and they were free. Thank you, whispered a woman about Maria's mother's age as the deputies cut her bonds. We thought no one was looking for. Someone's always looking, Cross replied quietly. Sometimes it just takes a while to find you. The rescue operation continued through the afternoon. The freed captives were given food, water, and medical attention. Arrangements were made to escort them back to the nearest town, where they could contact their families or receive assistance from local authorities. Maria found herself working alongside Cross as they helped care for the victim. She watched him interact with a young boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, speaking softly and offering comfort to the traumatized child. "You've done this before," she observed. Cross nodded. "Too many times. But it never gets easier seeing what people will do to each other." As the sun began to set, Sheriff Coleman approached them. "We'll be taking the prisoners back to town for trial, federal charges, so they'll face a judge in San Antonio. What they did here," he shook his head, "they'll hang for it." "Good," Maria said fiercely. Cross looked at her with something like approval. "Anger's natural," he said, "but don't let it consume you. These men made their choice to become monsters. You get to choose what kind of person you become after surviving." That night, as they camped on the trail back to town, Maria sat by the fire and reflected on everything that had happened. 3 days ago, she had been a frightened captive, facing a future too horrible to contemplate. Now she was free. Her captors were in chains, and dozens of other victims had been rescued, all because one man had chosen to act. "Mr. Cross," she said as the rancher sat down beside her with a cup of coffee, "just Sam. Sam, then, what you did, pulling that iron from the fire, stopping them from branding me, I'll never forget it." Cross stared into the flames for a long moment. "My Emily used to say that we're all put here to look after each other. Took me a while after losing her and the boy to remember that, but when I saw what those men were doing to you, to all those people, well, Emily was right. We're all we've got." Maria nodded, understanding. "What happens now? I mean, after we get back to town, you go home to your family if you can. If not, there are good people who'll help you find a new start. As for me, I go back to my ranch, take care of my cattle, keep an eye on the territory, and if something like this happens again," Cross's smile was slight but genuine, "then I guess I'll pull another iron from the fire." The next morning brought word that all the surviving captives had been safely reunited with their families or placed in the care of local authorities. Morrison and his surviving gang members were transported to San Antonio under heavy guard, where they would face federal charges for human trafficking, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Maria's own family had been frantically searching for her since the attack on their wagon train. The reunion in the town's small courthouse was emotional, filled with tears of relief and gratitude that she had not only survived, but had helped bring down the entire trafficking network. As the months passed, the story of the rescue in the canyon spread throughout the territory. Samuel Cross became something of a local legend, though he consistently refused to accept any praise for his actions. He returned to his ranch and his cattle, but his reputation ensured that few outlaws were willing to test their luck in his territory. Maria returned to her family's farm, but the experience had changed her. She had seen both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human courage. She began working with local authorities to establish better protections for travelers and to identify other trafficking routes that might be operating in the region. Years later, when Maria had become a teacher and advocate for victims of crime, she would often tell the story of that night by the campfire when a branding iron meant to mark her as property was knocked from a criminal's hand by a rancher's bullet. She would speak of how one man's decision to act had not only saved her life but had disrupted an entire network of human trafficking that had destroyed countless lives. But most importantly, she would remember Samuel Cross's words about choosing what kind of person to become after surviving evil. Maria chose to become someone who fought for justice, who stood up for the vulnerable, and who never forgot that sometimes the difference between hope and despair comes down to one person's willingness to pull the iron from the fire. The old branding iron, its crude now cold and powerless, gathered dust in the sheriff's evidence room as a reminder of a crime that would never be forgotten, and a rescue that proved that even in the darkest moments, there are those who will stand against injustice, no matter the cost. Samuel Cross continued his quiet work protecting the territory until his death many years later. At his funeral,
Dozens of people came forward to share stories of how he had helped them in their darkest hour. Among them was Maria, now a grown woman with children of her own, who spoke of the night a rancher had saved her from being branded as property and had taught her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. The legacy of that moment when hot iron met cold steel and justice prevailed lived on in every life that was saved, every victim who was rescued, and every person who chose to stand up against evil rather than turn away. In the end, that was Samuel Cross's true monument, not a stone marker in a cemetery, but the knowledge that his actions had inspired others to pull their own irons from the fire when the moment demanded it.